On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, thus bringing in the United States into World War II. After attacking the United States, the Japanese started their own blitzkrieg across the Pacific Ocean, getting to the doorsteps of Australia. But at the Battle of Guadalcanal, this was all changed around when the United States was one of the first of the Allies to stop the Japanese advance, turn them around, and start a long and brutal island hopping campaign that led all the way to the doorstep of Tokyo. The climax of sea fighting in the Solomons came in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. On November 11th through the 12th, the U.S. landed a sizable contingent of reinforcements and supplies on the island. At roughly the same time, a fleet of Japanese transports carrying some 7,000 men steamed southward from Rabaul behind an escort of several battleships and a large screen of cruisers and destroyers. When the Americans detected this force descending on their vulnerable transport and cargo vessels, they dispatched a force of cruisers and destroyers to fight a delaying action. The result was a series of violent confrontations that inflicted heavy losses on both sides, but left the United States in a position of strength in the southern Solomons. Just after midnight on November 13th, the U.S. task force, under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, engaged Japanese ships commanded by Vice Admiral Abe Hiroki. The battle that followed was a brutal 24-minute melee that saw capital ships on both sides blasting away at extremely close ranges. The Japanese lost the battleship Hai, while the U.S. lost the cruisers USS Atlanta and the USS Juno, as well as several destroyers. Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed in the engagement, and they were the only two flag officers of the U.S. Navy to be killed in a surface engagement in World War II. On November 14th, Japanese cruisers and destroyers shelled Henderson Field, and another invasion force was discovered north of Guadalcanal. The Japanese ships were subject to air attacks throughout the day, and that night they were engaged by the battleships USS Washington and the USS South Dakota. About midnight, contact was made north of Savo Island, and another fierce night action ensued. The Japanese lost the battleship Kirishima and the heavy cruiser Kintsuga, and the U.S. lost 3 more destroyers. The initial amphibious assault on the southern Solomons represented a superb coordination of Allied air, naval, and ground forces. Warships laid down heavy barrages to screen their approach of troop transport and carrier-based planes, and U.S. Army air forces bombed and softened Japanese defenses. Landing craft took the Marines ashore at key points throughout the islands, and the Marines rapidly secured a beachhead in Guadalcanal and captured the most complete airstrip that would become Henderson Field. They also seized the smaller island of Tulangi, Gaitu, and Tombogo. While the Japanese construction units on Guadalcanal were overcome with comparative ease or simply melted away into the jungle, the defenders of Tugali and Gaitu included elements of elite Special Naval Landing Forces, or the SNLF, and they fought desperately. The battle for Tunguligi saw the Japanese garrison destroyed virtually to the last man. This would serve as a grim preview of later engagements in the U.S. campaign in the Pacific. Almost as soon as the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders began preparing for the retaking of the island. Vandergrift had concentrated some 11,000 Marines into a tight defensive perimeter centered on Henderson Field. He had been warned of an imminent attack thanks to the efforts of U.S. encryptionalists who had penetrated the Japanese naval code. The Japanese, believing that the Americans had withdrawn many of their troops after the stinging defeat of Savo Island, vastly underestimated the strength of the U.S. presence on Guadalcanal. In the pre-dawn hours of August 21st, the Japanese launched their first ground offensive on Guadalcanal. At the Battle of Tenaru, U.S. Marines defeated and annihilated a force of some 900 veteran Japanese army troops east of Henderson Field. Shelling by Japanese ships and aerial bombardment from the Japanese planes became routine, but the U.S. defenders were able to cling to their narrow toehold on Guadalcanal thanks in part to the efforts of the so-called Cactus Air Force, a motley collection of Marine, U.S. Army Air Forces, and U.S. Navy aviators operating out of Henderson Field. Cactus Air Force pilots shot down more than 150 Japanese planes in the first 5 weeks of the battle, and Henderson's bombers contingent pounded Japanese warships and transports. On September 13th to the 14th, U.S. Marine Corps Corporal Merritt Red Mike Edson The 800 Marines on the 1st Raider Battalion and a handful of Marine parachute troops were subjected to one of the most intense assaults on Henderson Field thus far. When they were attacked by a Japanese force more than 3 times their size, their tenacious defense in what became called the Battle of Edson's Ridge helped to cement the reputation of the Raiders in the Marine lore and earn Edson the Medal of Honor. The Japanese forces on the island peaked strength of 36,000 troops by October, but they were unable to overwhelm the Americans' defensive perimeter and retake the airfield. The hardest fighting occurred on October 24th to October 25th, when a single Marine battalion was all that stood between Henderson Field and 2 Japanese regiments. The 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Chelsea Puller, repelled a Japanese assault and inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. Reinforced by soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, the 1st U.S. Army unit to land in Guadalcanal, Puller's Marines weathered repeated Japanese charges on their held positions. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry during the engagement, and Puller received the 3rd Navy Cross of an eventual 5. By November, the U.S. Navy was able to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal faster than the Japanese, and Allied counterattacks had steadily pushed the Japanese toward the northwest part of the island. In December, the 1st Marine Division was withdrawn after 4 months of intense combat, and the U.S. 25th Infantry Division began arriving on Guadalcanal. At the start of 1943, Allied combat strength on Guadalcanal stood at 2 U.S. Army divisions and a Marine regiment, totaling some 44,000 troops. Offensive operations continued through 1943, narrowing and compressing the Japanese position. During the first week of February, light surface craft began evacuating the 12,000 remaining Japanese troops from Guadalcanal, and on February 8, 1943, almost exactly 6 months after the initial landings, the last remaining Japanese pocket of resistance was eliminated, and Guadalcanal was at last firmly in Allied hands. Although U.S. losses were heavy in both the naval and ground campaigns, the Battle of Guadalcanal was decisive in that the U.S. positions in the southern Solomons were never again seriously threatened. The Japanese lost a total of 24,000 men killed in the Battle of Guadalcanal, while the Americans sustained 1,600 killed and 4,200 wounded, and several thousand dead from malaria and other tropical diseases. The various naval battles cost each side 24 warships. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 1 light carrier, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines, while the Americans lost 8 cruisers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 14 destroyers.